A Kohen, or for that matter the Kohen Gadol, is not permitted to serve in the Mishkan or the Beis HaMikdash unless they are wearing their appropriate uniform. And as we'll see in this week's parasha, the Torah tells us this in two different places, apparently in two different ways, as Rashi points out. And from that we'll learn a tremendous lesson, not just about the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol, but about what it is to be Jewish and our connection to Hashem. In our parasha, we also have the section that talks about preparing and wearing the clothing of the Kohanim, which concludes with the following instruction: of those uniforms should be on Aaron and his sons when they enter into the place of holiness, or when they approach the Mizbeach to do the holy service. And if they have those clothes, then they will not carry a sin and they will not die. Pirish Rashi, from which Rashi tells us, the fact that it says that if they wear the clothes they won't die, from that we learn that if a person would serve, if a Kohen would serve in the Beis HaMikdash or in the Mishkan without that uniform, then, God forbid, that the person would deserve the death penalty. At least Misvidei Shamayim, however it works. The Mefarshim have a question on Rashi. Hang on a second. 12 psukim earlier, Rashi already told us this information. What does the pasuk say earlier? That Aaron had to wear his uniform when he served. And you would hear the sound of the bells at the fringe of his me'il when he came into the holy place. If now Hashem in front of Hashem, and when he left, and then he would not die. Says Rashi, from the negative, you can imply the positive, which is if he has the uniform, he will not deserve, God forbid, the opposite of life. But if Aaron would enter into the Mishkan or subsequently the Kohen Gadol into the Beis HaMikdash missing one of these clothes, then he would deserve, God forbid, heavenly decree of death. So if that's the case, ask the Mefarshim, we already learned this a few psukim earlier. Why does Rashi have to repeat the same law and tell us, as if to say, from here we learn information? It's not from here. We've already got that information beforehand. So had we not seen Rashi's commentary on this second pasuk, then we could say we understand why the pasuk repeats the same information twice, because that's what psukim sometimes do, to emphasize how serious a transgression this would be. As we find in many places, the Torah often repeats the same prohibition or the same warning to illustrate that if a person transgresses, it's actually a double transgression or various other reasons. That's what we would have thought, but Rashi is now telling us that's not the case. Rashi here clearly says, the second time that it talks about not missing any of the clothes, he says, from here we learn. Which seems to imply that it is specifically from this second reference that we learn the law that the Kohen Gadol or the other Kohanim may not miss any of the uniform when they go serve in the Beis HaMikdash. So that doesn't make any sense. Rashi already in the previous pasuk explained this principle to us, and told us that we learn this principle from that pasuk. Why now is he saying that we learn it from this pasuk? So we're going to see various suggestions by the Mefarshim before we get to the one fundamental shift that the Rebbe is going to give us. So Ra'im Kosav Levo'er, one of the commentators on Rashi, the Ra'im says, the earlier pasuk that said that you have to have the uniform when you go into the Beis HaMikdash, that was only talking about Rak B'Negia Shisha Begadim Sheniskru B'Psukim Shekodim Lachein, was actually only referring to the 6 parts of the uniform that we already knew about at that point, namely the Choshen breastplate, the ephod, the so-called apron, Me'il, the long tunic, Kasoines, the shirt, Mitznefes Ve'avnet, and the hat and the belt. But we didn't yet know that the same prohibition applies to the tzitz headband that the Kohen Gadol wore, or the Michnasayim pants that all Kohanim wore, because they were not yet mentioned by the time we came across that early pasuk. And therefore, says the Re'im, that Rashi is telling us the added information. The fact that if the Kohen Gadol is not wearing his tzitz, or if any Kohen is not wearing Michnasayim and they come to serve in the Beis HaMikdash, that is an equal offense. That's what we're learning from this second pasuk that says, do not carry sin and therefore be chayiv, God forbid, death. Which is in our pasuk only after we had already learned about the tzitz and the pants. And the truth is, you can actually read this into the words if you really want. Rashi, we could probably see this in Rashi's words, because in the first pasuk, because of Rashi's words were, if a kohen entered the Beis Hamikdash missing one of these, keyword, these clothes, that implies the ones we've already spoken about. Whereas when Rashi was interpreting our pasuk, he didn't say these, he just said missing any clothing. And that would possibly indicate, because maybe as the Re'im is telling us, the Rashi's version is that at the time we come to the earlier pasuk, we only know about 6 garments, and therefore the Torah is only talking about what happens if any of those 6 are missing. Those that had already been listed. Whereas when we get to the latter pasuk there, Rashi leaves it much more generic, that if a kohen serves missing clothes at all, now we learn that it's any of the 8 garments of the Kohen Gadol, or of course the 4 of the Kohen Hedyot, that would be an offense and would be problematic. That's the Re'aim's suggestion, except that it raises another question for us. So who needed the first pasuk? So the question is now the other way around. We were trying to explain why we need the second pasuk. He's explained it. But based on this explanation, there apparently is no need for the earlier pasuk, because by the time the Torah has given us the names of all 8 types of uniform that the Kohanim had to wear, and then tells us, and you have to wear them because if not, chayav misa. Why did we need an earlier reference only about the 6 begodim? That seems inefficient. Knowing that the Torah is going to incorporate that in the 8 begodim, it's going to tell us in a later pasuk. So great answer to why we need the second pasuk, but you've just raised the question why we needed the first pasuk in the first place. So let's look at some of the other commentators. There were other Mefarshim who suggest, unlike the Re'aim, who said that the first pasuk is talking about 6 of the garments, and the second pasuk is talking about all 8 of the garments of the Kohen Gadol. The other Mefarshim say, actually, that's not the case. They were not talking generically about the garments at all. The earlier pasuk was only talking about the long me'il tunic that the Kohen Gadol used to wear. Because that's the subject of that particular pasuk and the immediate context. So yes, there are other garments that are listed earlier, but that's not what the Torah is talking about at that point. So therefore, what's it saying that you have to have in order to avoid misa is the me'il. Whereas the second later pasuk, that they have to, Aaron and his sons have to wear them. What is them? Is only referring to the pants that the Kohanim would wear under the uniform. And the reason that we would suggest that is because that's the immediate context. That was the particular levush, the beged, that was spoken about just beforehand. How come then did Rashi speak in such a generic way and say that if a person serves in the Beis Hamikdash missing any part of the uniform, if you're actually saying that we're talking specifically about the Me'il in Pasuk 1 and about the Michnasayim in Pasuk 2, right? The earlier Pasuk, he was even maybe a little bit more specific. He said if you're missing one of these garments, how does that work if you're only talking about one garment anyway, the Me'il? So these Mefarshim will say, well, that's factual, but Rashi is not suggesting that those facts emerge from these psukim. We know it from elsewhere. Because they will argue that the fundamental principle that a Kohen Gadol has to work only wearing the uniform is something we get from a different pasuk. What's the pasuk? That you have to put the belts around the Kohanim. This is an instruction to Moshe dressing up the Kohanim for service. And those garments, that uniform, that will be the symbol of their kahuna as an eternal principle of Judaism. In other words, the Torah is telling us that without these garments, you're not a kohen, you cannot be in service. Ukti alafina b'gemara mi pasuk zen. The Gemara learns exactly that from that pasuk. Shebizman shebigdehem aleihem kunasam aleim. As long as that uniform is on them, they are officially kohanim. Ein bigdehem aleihem ein kunasam aleim. But if they are not wearing those garments, they are not considered kohanim. V'havu lahu zarim, and they are considered like any other member of the Jewish nation. Zor sheshimesh chayv misa, and any person who is not a kohen who serves in the Beis Hamikdash is deserving chas v'shalom of the death penalty. So, what's Rashi telling? Rashi knows that the fact is that you're not allowed to serve without a full uniform. That any one of the begodim that is missing is a capital offense. But therefore, Pirush Rashi lefio emes. Therefore, these Mefarshim say, in spite of the fact that we only learn the details of the Me'il from the first pasuk, we only learn the details of the Michnasayim from the second pasuk, but Rashi will comment that any of those parts of the uniform that are missing would be chayv misa, because that's the truth. It's a wonderful suggestion, but it really does not fit with what Rashi always seeks to do, which is to explain things in the simplest way. First of all, in order for this commentary to work, Rashi is relying on us knowing information the Torah hasn't yet spoken about, and we know that Rashi doesn't usually do that. He'll usually give us information we haven't yet learned. But besides that, there are two other issues with this particular explanation. Aleph, Ala pasuk dilalon. Let's go to that pasuk that is officially the source of the fact that a kohen may not serve unless he's wearing his uniform. Look at Rashi over there. Rashi doesn't breathe a word of what the Gemara says, that they have to wear their uniform in order to qualify as Kohanim, in order to be able to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Doesn't say that at all. And a Pirush Amrak, all he says is, this was their initiation in order to become permanent Kohanim. That's just a generic principle about what happened during the 7 days of inaugurating Kohanim to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. It has no bearing on what you wear in order to be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. So if that's Rashi's view, it would be quite a stretch to say that Rashi here is relying on the fact that we know information from a pasuk later on, when that same pasuk later on, Rashi doesn't even explain in the context of what we'd like it to be, that that's the source, that the Kohen has to be fully uniformed in order to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Question 2, Beis. Let's go back to the first Rashi that we've quoted over here. Where Rashi just says simply, that if the Kohen would enter missing one of the items of his uniform, it would be a capital offense. You could maybe stretch the point to say, that there Rashi was speaking based on the correct principle, although it's not learned from that pasuk, that a kohen has to serve wearing his full uniform, even though this is not where we're learning it from. But you could never squeeze that into the second pasuk. Remember, Rashi began the second pasuk by saying, from here, from here we learn that a kohen has to wear his uniform when he serves in the Beis Hamikdash. Clearly from here, and not from the pasuk that is coming later. So what has this particular commentary helped us? And so therefore we're back to square one. Why is Rashi explaining effectively the same principle, two different psukim, as if to say that the Torah is teaching us the same thing twice without it being because it wants to show the severity of the transgression? So we're going to suggest one other potential explanation, and then we'll see the Rebbe's fundamental shift. Perhaps there's another way to explain this, and that's and that would be based on another distinction that we're going to notice between the wording of Rashi in his two commentaries over here. But Pasuk Arishan, the first time that Rashi discusses this issue, Lashon Rashi, he uses the expression Ha'im yikones mechus echad min habegodim, that if the kohen will enter the space, the precinct of the Beis Hamikdash with a missing piece of the uniform, that's a problem. Whereas in the second pasuk he says that the problem is not entering the space, the problem is serving and actually performing the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. Maybe that's the big issue over here. In fact, the Mefarshim say exactly this. Going back to the version that says the first pasuk was only really telling us about the Me'il. Where the Torah tells us one of the objectives of the Me'il was to, so to speak, announce the Kohen's arrival in the holy precinct by the bells that jingled at the bottom of the Me'il. It's when he's entering, right? That's when the bells are ringing to announce his arrival. So that clearly is telling us that the pasuk must be addressing the kohen's entry into the space, regardless of whether or not he would actually perform one of the ritualistic avodas that are required in the Beis Hamikdash. Whereas the latter pasuk, which says they shouldn't carry any kind of sin and be chas v'shalom chayav misa, there the Torah is talking specifically about approaching the mizbeach in order to serve in the holy service. That's obviously telling us that if a person serves while missing part of the uniform, that's a capital offense. It's talking about avodah. There's your distinction. The first pasuk is talking about entering the space, and that's a problem if a kohen, is missing part of his uniform. The second pasuk is talking about serving in the space, and that's a problem if he's missing his uniform. You'll ask, why do I need both? If I already know that it's a transgression to enter the Beis Hamikdash missing part of the uniform, so surely you don't have to tell me, and not only is it transgression to enter missing part of the uniform, but it's also transgression to serve missing part of the uniform. Well, surely that's obvious. The guy crossed the threshold of the Beis Hamikdash. He's chayav misa. What's the difference now if he serves missing a part of his uniform? Okay, well, we could explain that. The Mefarshim suggest a couple of different perspectives. Number one, the pasuk over there was talking about entering where the Oyel Moed, which in the Beis Hamikdash would be the Heichal, the actual building of the Beis Hamikdash. If you enter there as a kohen without part of the uniform, that's a problem. But we don't know that it's a problem to be in the outdoor open air chotzer of the Beit HaZorah, the chatzar of the Mishkan, the hazara of the Beis Hamikdash, begishtam el mizbech, when you're approaching the mizbech, maybe that's okay to be missing a part of the uniform. Therefore, that's what the second pasuk would come and explain to us. Begishtam el mizbech l'shoros b'kodesh, even if it's outdoors, but the person is approaching to serve at the mizbech. There is no prohibition to walk into the azara with a missing part of the uniform, but there is a transgression the minute he begins to serve in that space, missing part of the uniform. As Rashi said, serving while missing part of the uniform is a capital offense. Also, this very fact that Rashi is telling us that there is a transgression, capital offense to enter the Beis Hamikdash missing part of the uniform, and there's a capital offense to serve in the Beis Hamikdash missing part of the uniform. That's because we have two psukim to illustrate that information to us. So the first pasuk is illustrating to us the principle that entering the Beis Hamikdash missing part of the uniform is problematic. And the second pasuk is specifying that serving without the entire uniform is problematic. Had there only been a single pasuk, we actually would have misunderstood, and we would have thought where the Torah is going with this is that if a person serves in the Beis Hamikdash missing part of the uniform, that's a capital offense. We would not know that even just simply walking in missing part of the uniform is a capital offense. Hence, we need two psukim. Maybe that's the explanation. There's a distinction between entering versus serving in the Beis Hamikdash, and Rashi illustrates that distinction. But it's not perfect. Because even this explanation does not seamlessly fit with the simplest understanding of the pasuk. Because the truth be told, the later pasuk addresses not only serving in the Beis Hamikdash, which is where we were going with this, but even entering the Beis Hamikdash. Because what does it say? If they come into the Oyel Moed, or they serve. There you have it, both of them, entering and serving. They shouldn't do that in order that they don't die. And therefore the latter pasuk would be enough to give us the information that there are two possible transgressions, both of which are capital offenses. One is entering the space, one is serving in the space. Again, back to square one. Why do we need two psukim? especially when you consider something the Rebbe discussed elsewhere. That actually, halachically, a kohen has no business walking into the Ohel Moed unless he is there to serve. You can't just casually walk in and look around and, I don't know. So therefore, the minute the Torah says that a kohen has to wear the uniform in order to enter into the holy space, that must imply that the kohen is entering the space in order to serve. So why do you have to then tell me additionally, and it's prohibited to serve without the full uniform? Our question is back in force. Why is it necessary, as Rashi points out, to have two separate sources from which we learn effectively the same principle that a Kohen Gadol may not serve in the Beis Hamikdash, missing parts of his uniform? Which, by the way, now that we haven't satisfied our explanation of Rashi, we have to understand why Rashi uses different language in his two interpretations. That the one he says is the first reference is if one of these parts of the uniform is missing, that's a problem. Whereas the second one he says he leaves it far more open-ended, that if a kohen serves without a full uniform, that is a capital offense. So in order to understand all of this, and here comes the Rebbe's big shift, let's look at a significant distinction between everything about each of these two explanations that Rashi gives. It's not about, you'll see it in the words, but it's not simply about the words, it's about what's the goal of Rashi's commentary. We're going to start with the second pasuk and then reflect back on the first pasuk. So, L'shayin Rashi b'pirush al pasuk hasheni mem gimel. So, pasuk mem gimel, which is the second pasuk we read, Rashi speaks he besignan shel din in the style of law. Ho lo madata. From here we derive. There you go. From here we derive that this is the law. What is the law? Shamish mechusa begodim b'misa. That if a kohen serves missing part of his uniform, that's a capital offense. Whereas the earlier pasuk lamed hey, hu besignon shel sipur devarim, is a simple narration without halachic overtones. What is the narration? What's he telling us factually? Had the kohen entered with part of his uniform missing, that would be a capital offense. That's telling us what's happening. It's not ruling that this is the halacha. And that is the key of understanding the difference between the two Rashis. Rashi's not simply repeating the same information twice, he's actually telling us two different perspectives. HaPasuk Mem Gimel, the latter pasuk, the uniform should be on the kohanim, so that they don't chas v'shalom die. And that's an eternal statute for him and his family. That is a general principle that applies to every single kohen, whether it be a kohen gadol, the kohen hedyot, whether it be the greatest kohen of the group or the ordinary kohen, or v'chol adoros, right across the span of history. Whereas the earlier pasuk, there the pasuk singled out Aaron and said the uniform has to be on Aaron when he is serving. That is zoning in on a Kohen Gadol represented here by Aaron. And that's the earlier pasuk that is addressing Aaron. We don't know yet what the halacha will be for the regular Kohanim. That's what the second pasuk is coming to add. So the first pasuk is describing the reality of Aaron HaKohen. The second pasuk is illustrating the halacha for all Kohanim. Now, when the pasuk tells us that if you're missing a garment, it's a problem, it's not only referring to the four garments that every single kohen wears, which is effectively the equalizer between the kohen gadol and a regular kohen. Rashi actually explains it in the beginning of the pasuk where he says, "Ve'hayu al Aaron," it should be on Aaron. Kol abegodim o'ela al Aaron haru'uyin loy. All those garments which are suitable to Aaron as the kohen gadol have to be worn by him. Ve'al banav ha'amurim bahem, and his sons, in other words, the regular kohanim, have to wear the clothes that are suitable for them. So hang on a second. That means that in the latter pasuk, we have learned the law that a regular Kohen has to serve with all of his 4 pieces of his uniform, and the Kohen Gadol, Aaron, has to wear all the 8 parts of his uniform. So if that's the case, why do we need a pasuk, special pasuk for Aaron earlier on? So that's not a problem. Because, as we've already pointed out, the earlier pasuk is a very specific law. As Rashi says, that should the Kohen Gadol enter missing one of these begodim, not one of his begodim, one of these begodim, which we're going to now explain, is specifically 3 out of the special begodim of the Kohen Gadol, and we'll have to understand why. So if we if we take the simplest understanding of Rashi's comment, it means this. When Rashi says that the Kohen Gadol dare not enter the Beis HaMikdash without these specific garments, Rashi is not talking about all 6 of the garments that had already been listed before them, which is Choshen, Ephod, Me'il, Mitznefes, Kesonos, Ve'avneit. Why not? Because, yes, all we know about these particular garments is that they were listed beforehand. Okay. And Be'ez of Tchilas HaParasha was earlier on in the parasha. So that it's not necessarily so directly linked to the conversation that's happening now. What Rashi is referring to over here is 3 specific garments that the Kohen Gadol must make sure to have on when he enters the Beis HaMikdash, namely ha'ephod, his special apron-like garment, ha'choshen, the breastplate, v'ha'me'il, and the long tunic with the bells and pomegranates at the bottom. Because those are the things that are part of the conversation at that point in the parasha. These are the instructions that were given at that point in the parasha, and there is something unique about these particular garments, as we shall learn, which is why they have a unique law about them. You know what we're going to find that's unusual about each of these 3 begodim? That when the Torah gives us the instruction of what these begodim should be, it adds afterwards, the Torah tells us what their unique role and purpose is, which it does not do for the other 5 begodim. So what does it tell us? When the Torah tells us about how to design the ephod for the Kohen Gadol, then it says, you then put the 2 stones on the shoulders of the ephod with the names of the Bnei Yisrael as a remembrance before Hashem. There's the purpose. What's the purpose of the ephod? That whenever the Kohen Gadol, Aaron HaKohen, enters the Beis HaMikdash, he is carrying a memory or reminder of the Jewish people. Purpose. After the Torah tells us how to design the choshen breastplate, it tells us the purpose. That Aaron will carry the names of the Shvatim on his heart. So the whole Jewish people is carried on his heart. To enter the holy space. That their memory will constantly be before Hashem. And Aaron will carry, so to speak, the rule, so to speak, or the law of the Bnei Yisrael on his heart always. And when it comes to the me'il, it says of Parashas HaMe'il, V'hoya al Aaron l'shores, that the me'il will be on Aaron while he serves or in order to serve. V'nishma koiloi b'voya al HaKodesh l'fnei Hashem. But say so, and one of the purposes of the me'il is that it should announce his arrival and his exit from the Beis HaMikdash by making the ringing sound of the bells that are at the bottom of the me'il. Zoyse meris, in other words, if you read what the purpose of these 3 garments are, you see that their purpose is fulfilled when the Kohen Gadol enters, key word, enters the Beis HaMikdash. The fact that Aaron walks into the Beis HaMikdash wearing these clothes, already in the Yefedes Pe'ulah Meyuchedes, achieves something. It creates a reminder, awareness of the Jewish people close to Hashem, Lifnei Hashem. Through the names of the Yidden which are on the stones, either of the shoulder elements of the ephod or the breastplate of the choshen. Mishpat bnei Yisrael aliboy shalidei achoshen Shapir Rashi Heitev Rashi Teichen Zeh Shapir Heitev Rashi Teichen Zeh Mekayim Hanal Rashi goes into a lot of detail about it, what that means, and what consciousness that creates for the Jewish people in front of Hashem. And the Me'il has a slightly different role, which is not about necessarily reminding, whatever that means, the Eibishter about the Eden, but it's about announcing his arrival. Now, any of the other parts of the uniform, where the Torah does not tell us why you have to wear them, but the Torah speaks generally about all of the clothes that make up the uniform and tells us that you should put those clothes onto Aaron and his sons, and then you anoint them with oil, and then you empower them and you sanctify them, that they should be my kohanim. So what's the purpose of the other garments? They're linked for the initiation of the kohanim, in order that the kohanim should be able to serve. So when the Torah is talking about all the parts of the uniform which are required in order to do the service in the Beis Hamikdash, how does that pasuk conclude? There the pasuk says that the purpose of the uniform is to be able to serve Hashem. So the Me'il, Ephod, and the Choshen are clearly for Aaron to be able to enter the Beis Hamikdash. The other begadim are for Kohanim to be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. There's our key distinction. That means that the other 5 parts of the uniform don't each have their unique particular purpose. They all share the same purposes, facilitating a kohen to be able to serve in the Beis Hamikdash. Now we know why we need to learn 2 different styles of learning about the Kohanim's uniforms from the 2 psukim. And we can understand the distinction between Rashi's 2 approaches to these 2 psukim and what we learn from them. When you're talking generically about all of the uniform of the Kohanim, from that we learn that if a Kohen or Kohen Gadol chas v'shalom serves without all of the uniform on, that is a capital offense. The fishin yonim kosher avodah v'shimish, because the general uniform, its purpose is to facilitate serving in the Beis Hamikdash. So serving without it is a problem. But earlier on, when he talks about these specific garments, which is Shloisha HaBegadim, Ephod, Choshen, and Me'il, which we've identified as these 3 special parts of the Kohen Gadol's uniform, they're the problem with missing those items out of the uniform. Is not a problem only once the person starts to serve. Just simply walking into the Beis Hamikdash without having these parts of the uniform is a serious problem. Should the Kohen Gadol walk in without one of these 3 elements, what's going to be missing is what that part of the uniform is supposed to achieve, either on behalf of the Jewish people in the case of the Ephod and the Choshen, or on behalf of the Kohen Gadol in the case of the Me'il, when you enter. Therefore, it's a capital offense because he is not fulfilling the purpose for which that uniform was given, or that part of the uniform was given. Now, you may have a question at this point. The tzitz also has its own specific, unique purpose. How come it's not on that list? After we're told how to design the tzitz, the Torah also gives us a purpose, which is that Aaron should wear it on his forehead, and that will atone for any mistakes in the process of designating things for karbanos, etc. And always the Aaron or the Kohen Gadol has to wear it on his forehead to consistently atone for the Jewish people. There is a purpose. And there you go. The purpose of the tzitz is not to do the avodah service in the Beis Hamikdash. It's to be on Aaron at all times in order to achieve an additional purpose. So how come the tzitz is not included with the Choshen, Ephod, and Me'il? That should be one of the garments that just simply walking to the Beis Hamikdash without it is a problem. How come it's grouped with the generic parts of the uniform, where just if you're not wearing them while serving, that's the issue? Well, the explanation is actually quite logical once we realize it. The tzitz might appear to also have a purpose and therefore be similar to the choshen milah and ephod, but actually the tzitz operates in a completely different way to any of the other begodim, those included. Rashi picks this up by the fact that the Torah tells us that it has to be al mitzchoy tamid, constantly on the Kohen Gadol's forehead. Well, it's not constantly on his forehead. If he walks out of the Beis Hamikdash, he's got to remove it. Therefore, Rashi explains, tamid leratzis lohem, it is permanently able to atone for the Jewish people, even when it's not on Aaron's forehead. Because if the Kohen Gadol is not on duty, is not wearing the tzitz is still operational 24/7, 365. So that puts the tzitz into a category of its own. It's not even like the choshen milah and ephod, which are activated the minute the Kohen Gadol walks into the Beis Hamikdash. The tzitz is always on. Not only does it have to be in the Beis Hamikdash, it doesn't even have to be on its wearer. It is something unique about the tzitz. It is ongoing. It doesn't belong in any category, and certainly not in the category of those things where it's only problematic if you are not wearing them to enter the Beis Hamikdash. So Rashi clearly has an innovative perspective on these halachas. Because Rashi is clearly telling us something we did not realize beforehand, that there are two categories of clothing that the Kohanim have to wear, each with its own set of laws. Let's say there's a Kohen Gadol, walks into the Heichal without one of the parts of the uniform, doesn't do any of the avodah, and walks out. Whether that was problematic or not will depend on which item of the uniform was missing. If he was missing any of the five, so to speak, more generic parts in the uniform, it's not a capital offense. He walked in, he walked out. There, the prohibition is only against serving. He didn't serve. But should the Kohen Gadol even for 1 second walk into the Heichal missing the Me'il Choshen or Ephod, that's a capital offense, even if he did not do any of the avodah. Rashi says that very simply in his words, if he will enter missing one of these components, that is chayiv misa. Of course, it's misa b'dei shamayim. It's not executed by the base now. Now there's a beautiful explanation behind why the Kohen Gadol would have these two elements to his uniform. So now that we've identified not just two parts of his uniform, but two parts of his service, that one part of what the Kohen Gadol does is Aleph Knisasa Kodesh. He enters the holy space representing us. And in order to do that properly, he has to specifically have these three garments on him. And then there's another layer to what the Kohen Gadol does in that space, and that is V'avodah b'kodesh, that he serves. He does avodah, performs various avodos inside the Beis Hamikdash, and that is in Kol Shmenes HaBegadim with his full uniform. These two elements of the Kohen Gadol's service reflect two impacts or two elements of how he draws the Jewish people into the spiritual experience. So firstly, you've got the impact of the avodah, which is done either by the Kohen Gadol or all Kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash, which the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol performs either as our emissary or as our power of attorney. What is that avodah? What is the Kohen or the Kohen Gadol achieving by bringing sacrifices or ketores or whatever else is the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash? By doing that avodah, the Kohen Gadol forges a bond between the Jewish people who are not even inside the Beis Hamikdash necessarily and Hashem. That bond between us and Hashem could happen in two potential ways. Aleph, though the most obvious way is we have a connection to Hashem because of what we do. So we do what Hashem wants, and that builds a relationship between us and Hashem. Through learning Torah and performing mitzvahs. Like the Gemara Kiddushin tells us, why are we here? Why were we created? In order to serve the Eibusher. We serve the Eibusher, we create a bond. But then there's something deeper. Beis. There's the core essence of what it is to be a Jewish person. We are the Eibishter's children, or at the very least, the Eibishter's servants, even before we start to do anything. It is who we are, not what we do. That's a bond that is intrinsic, not contingent on behavior. And again, the Rebbe has explained this elsewhere in a different sicha. Why is it that the Jewish people we find are compared to this precious treasure? Like the valuables that a king locks away in his treasure house and nobody ever sees. Whatever is hidden away in the royal vaults is not ever intended to be used for royal purposes, for government purposes, for running the country, for paying expenses. Why are they there? So that the king will have a tremendous amount of personal pleasure. So we, the Jewish people, are the national treasure of the Eibishter. Just like the national treasure gives this tremendous sense of nachas and beauty to the king, our mere existence, even before we're put into the so-called spiritual budget of transforming this world into a holy place, just the fact that we exist is already valuable to the Eibishter. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mishta'asher b'Yisrael, the Eibishter takes great nachas in the Jewish people. And that explains the two areas of the Kohen Gadol service in the Beis HaMikdash. The first thing is the Kohen Gadol walks in. By him walking in, that symbolizes the entire Jewish nation walking into the space, because the Kohen Gadol does not enter as a private citizen, he enters as the representative of the entire Jewish people. So as he walks through the door, the whole Jewish nation is inside the Heichal, in the holiest places. And they're there in a way that the Eibishter, so to speak, is cognizant of us. The Kohen Gadol hasn't even done anything yet. He hasn't begun to serve the Eibishter yet. He's just walked in. Just having the Kohen Gadol walk into the Beis HaMikdash already arouses the Eibishter's, so to speak, acknowledgement of who we are in the essence of our beings. We're the Eibishter's children, we're the Eibishter's servants, before we even do the first step of serving Hashem. And then after the Kohen Gadol has achieved that fundamental statement of fact, the Jews are one with the Eibishter, we're the Eibishter's national treasure, and we belong in his Beis HaMikdash to be, so to speak, front and center, then he could start doing avodah. And the Kohen Gadol doing the specifics of the avodah, bringing karbanos, sprinkling blood, bringing ketores, shechting, that is a representation of we doing all of the steps of our avodah to Hashem. And that will also explain why it is specifically the three garments that we have itemized, choshen, ephod, or me'il, that are specifically the ones that represent the Kohen Gadol walking in. These three different garments represent the Jewish people in three different stages of spiritual development. We'll start from the top. So first of all, you've got the ephod and the choshen that actually carry the names of the Jewish people, not written with ink, but rather etched into the stone itself. That obviously represents a lofty state of Jewish people. You look at them and you can see that they're Jewish. They represent what being Jewish is all about. And it's not a show, it's chakika, it is etched into their souls. Like you look at these stones and you see the names of the Bnei Yisrael. Now the truth is, there too, you can split them into two groups. You have the choshen which sits on Aaron's heart, which is obviously a very important part of the human anatomy. They represent the Jewish people who've done such a powerful job of self-transformation and growth that they have transformed their nefesh abamis to become holy. Their heart is in the right place, so to speak. The ephod, whereas the ephod, the stone part of the ephod, is here on the shoulders. It's not in front of the person where you could actually see it. These are Yidden who definitely express what it is to be Jewish through fighting against their temptations and against their distractions in a way of iskafia, which means you're still kind of behind the realm of holiness. You're trying to get to the realm of holiness, like the stones on the shoulder, which you don't necessarily see until you start turning your head back. The me'il, which is this long flowing tunic that goes almost to the floor, that represents the Jewish people are still at a very lowly level. Where their only real connection to their Judaism is that they do what Judaism says. It's one of the reasons why we have pomegranates made out of material, obviously, at the bottom of the meal, because that alludes to the type of Jew, as the Rebbe is explained elsewhere, who is still like a pomegranate. As the pasuk says, the pasuk in Shir Hashirim tells us that your temples are like this adornment of pomegranates, and the Gemara comments on that word rakoseich and says that even the so-called empty, devoid of spirituality Jew is filled with mitzvahs like the pomegranate is filled with seeds. So now you got the Kohen Gadol walking into the Beis HaMikdash with representation of the highest Jew on the Choshen, the Jew who's really working on himself on the ephod, and the Jew who's just getting by, kind of following by rote, who's at the bottom of the Me'il. That is what draws the Eibishter's, so to speak, awareness and attention to us. The entire Jewish people is represented over here. And now you understand the severity of the transgression of walking in, missing some of this. If the Kohen Gadol wants the Eibishter to notice the Jewish people, he has to include every segment of the Jewish population. God forbid, if one group of the Jews is left out of the picture, either it has no effect for the Kohen Gadol to walk in, or it has diminished effect for the Kohen Gadol to walk in. Because when you're reminding or bringing to the Eibishter's attention, whatever that means, the Jewish people, and the fact that the Jewish people have this union with Hashem, there can be no distinction between one kind of Jew and the next. It is something that is universal to every Jew. So if one Jew is missing, the whole thing is missing, because in order to have that connection to the Eibishter, it has to be whole. And that has a powerful lesson, a powerful lesson for every rabbi, every teacher, every spiritual guide, so any person who could have a positive influence on another Jew. If you encounter a Jewish person, regardless of where they are spiritually, and the first thing you have to do is like the Kohen Gadol did, make them noticeable, meaning to remind this person, you know who you really, really are. You're a neshama that is a piece of the Eibishter. That's who you are. And as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that neshama emerged from the Eibishter's wisdom to enter the human body. And then like a Kohen Gadol, you'll be taking that person into a place of holiness. And the only way we can do this successfully is we have to be empowered by the Kohen Gadol of our generation, through our bond with the tzaddikim, obviously the Nasi Hador, as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, by having a meaningful relationship with the tzaddik is as if we are connected to the Shechina itself. As the Alter Rebbe says in the second parak of Tanya, that by having a meaningful relationship with tzaddikim, we connect. This is something which is relevant to every single Jewish person. And then when you're getting through the door, then you could start working on avodah, including the avodah of cleansing all the negative, to get rid of whatever negative might have clung to the person through this, various aberrant behaviors. Get the person to avoid doing things that are bad, and get them to increase in doing things that are positive. And by us fulfilling the objective of living up to the clothes, the uniform of the Kohen Gadol, what it represents, we will then be zoiche to the Eibishter, giving those uniforms to the Kohanim in the time of Moshiach, when Aaron and his sons and Moshe will be with the Jewish people, but Beis Hamikdash Hashlishi, in the third Beis Hamikdash, it should be rebuilt immediately.